before I begin tonight, I want each one of you to think. It's probably been going on in your family system for years. Think of an argument that happens in your family that's never resolved. It's always the same issue. You know what it is in our family? It's money. It was between my father and my mother. It was with all my sisters and their husbands, and it's with all my nieces and their husbands. You know what happens in our family? The men think the money is theirs because they work for it. And they dole it out to the women like it's not theirs, you know? And it gets the women in our family constantly angry. In fact, when my mom went shopping, and she had things she was bringing home, and my dad was sitting in the front room, my mom always left the packages in the trunk of the car. She never brought them inside. Because my dad let her buy anything she wanted, but made her feel a little guilty about everything she bought. You're buying that again? Didn't you get a purse last year? In fact, when my dad died, my mom went out for a 6-month shopping spree that she bought everything in San Francisco. But you know how she paid for it? She took most of it back. But that's a family argument, and I'll talk about that in a minute. That's our family argument. It's never resolved, and it goes on from generation to generation. Now, you may have a few of those in your family. Now, I want you to think of an argument, get a specific person that you always argue about the same issue, and it's never resolved. You're always arguing about the same issue. I'm going to give you a positive program to resolve those issues. Now, first of all relationships have an I and a we. It actually has 2 I's and 1 we. Every relationship. Now, when there's too much I, too much control, or too much dependency, too much we get angry. It's like when you're driving a car and the red light goes on that you're burning up the engine. If you don't stop the car, you're going to burn up the engine. In all relationships, when you get angry, it's saying there's something wrong with the relationship that you have to fix. There's too much control going on, or there's too much dependency. Too much I, too much we. Do you follow me so far? Now, let me, since Don's standing in front of you, how we figured this out. When I met Don many years ago, he was a young paramedic. He loved to play. And actually, Don was the one that challenged me to do this ministry. You know, I was working in the parish. He says, why don't you bring this? We got to bring our message to a bigger group. And he says, I'll help you do it. We'll do it together. That was 20 years ago. Well, you know what happened in working together? After a few months, I was doing everything, and he was doing nothing. You see, I'm a controller. Too much I. There's a right way, there's a wrong way, there's my way. And if you don't do it my way, it's just only proof the only person to do it right is me. So I'm always yelling at him. I'm doing everything. I'm doing too much. You're not doing enough. Do you have that argument with anybody? Well, one day I had this brilliant insight. Who's making me do everything? Where's the gun to my head? I'm doing everything because I want to do everything. You know, I got this brilliant insight. Now, you follow me, and we've changed. I want to get to this point because it really has helped our relationship tremendously. Now, before I get to this point, I threw this challenge out Thursday. In all my life, I learned from things, most things, pretty quickly. I'm a quick learner. That's why I'm so wise. I've made a lot of mistakes. And I've learned from them. But there's one thing I did that I kept doing all my life, well into my 40s, even though I failed every time. That was thinking I could change you. Today, I absolutely believe I can change no one. I don't have that kind of power. But I challenge you Thursday. I told anyone who's ever been able to change anybody, make sure you come and tell me, prove it to me, because I'd love to start doing it again. You know what? Nobody came to me. And you know what a bad mistake? You know what a bad decision is? Thinking I'm going to change my spouse after I get married. That's a bad decision. Now, I can't change anybody. You can't change me. I can't change you. So anger can't be about blaming. When I blame somebody, I'm trying to change them. But I can't change anybody. So anger can't be about blaming. Anger's about me changing. Anger's not about me blaming. Anger's about me changing. Every time I get angry, I have to change. There's too much I or too much we. See, in our relationship, Don and I, when from my point, there was too much I. There wasn't enough we. I told Don, I told him that. I said, I'm going to not do so much anymore. I'm going to quit controlling. I'm going to quit controlling. And you know what? He's doing this taping. He's put the website together. He's writing a book. And he's getting ready to replace me. Anger was about me changing. If I didn't change, I could have never given him the opportunity to do anything, you know? Do you follow me? There was too much I, there wasn't enough we. That's right, Don. You know, remember. God works in funny ways. I get this phone call. Now, I can tell you this story because none of you will ever know my family. My sister, Barb, she had 5 kids. And they all got to the age when they left the house. You know, they say in the marriage, the best time in the marriage is before the kids come and after they leave. Well, they finally left. And she now she could have the freedom. Well, you know what happened? She had a surprise in her mid-40s. A surprise baby. Now, usually when married couples let the kids go, they have to rediscover each other. A lot of times you lose a relationship while you have the kids. Well, my sister had not found her husband yet. She was still going through the middle-age crisis. And so what she did is when she brought her boy home, he was called Christopher, she established Christopher as king of the house. I always called him King Christopher. Whatever Christopher wanted, Christopher got. She lived her life through Christopher. If Christopher struck out, she struck out. If somebody didn't like Christopher, they didn't like her. She lived her life through her son. But you know what? She didn't create any consequences. See, when you live your life through somebody, you have to have them like you. And when you have to have them like you, they run the house. So she didn't create any consequences. Christopher could do whatever he wanted. Well, as Christopher started to get older, he started complaining, "Hey, Mom, quit smothering me." And she started complaining, getting angry, because he had no consequences. He did just what he wanted to. Get the picture? Well, she calls me on Sunday. That Christopher had just informed her, he's in the 6th grade now, that he's not going to go to church anymore. Well, I couldn't keep my mouth shut. You know, I always have to have the last word. I said, "Barb, why are you surprised? He's been running the house ever since he's been born." I had to say it. I couldn't stop myself. Anyway, I said to her, "Barb, you and Christopher have been getting a lot of fights lately. Anger's about you changing, not about you blaming. Christopher is too much of an I, and you're too much of a we." I said, "You got to change." I said, "What you got to do is you got to let Christopher live his own life. Everybody's got to learn to strike out. Everybody's got to learn that not everybody likes you. But you got to start creating consequences." And I said, now here's the thing, because I have a totally different attitude for grade school kids and high school kids going to church. I think grade school kids go to church as part of the family. They do it as a family. And that's how kids are planted seeds of faith. What do kids do if they're not ever exposed to religion or spirituality? What do they do when they get into messes? Where do they go? Where do they get that strength? Anyway, I said, Barb, next Sunday, if he tells you he's not going to go to church, don't argue with him, don't fight with him, just tell him there are consequences. If he can't go to church with his family, he can't play with his friends. That's the consequence. I said two principles. Make sure you mean what you say. If you don't mean what you say, he won't listen to you. So don't say it if you don't want to follow through. You know, that's what happens. If you say things to your kids and you don't follow through, they quit listening. My mom was a great disciplinarian without being a disciplinarian. We were decent around the dinner table. We went to bed when we were supposed to. We were quiet in church. When guests came over to visit my parents, we got away and entertained ourselves. We didn't have to entertain. Why? Because when my mom said something, she meant it. So we always listened to her. My dad was just the opposite. If he said something, we knew if we worked on him hard enough, we'd get him to change his mind. So whenever my dad said something, we didn't listen to what he said. We were trying to figure out how we could change his mind. In fact, you know, when I used to teach teachers how to teach, that's one of the most important things I used to teach them in the classroom, is whenever you say anything in the classroom, make sure you follow through. Because if you don't follow through, the kids quit listening. I said, that's the first thing. I said, the second thing is don't take him personally. He's not doing it to you. Don't give him the silent treatment. Don't ask, how can you do this to your mother? Don't do any of that stuff. Don't take it personally. That's conditional love. He's not doing it to you. And I told her, if you take it personally, then that's going to become the issue. Conditional love. And the person will never learn the consequences. You know what hard love is? I'm sure you've heard the word. Hard love is I love you so much that I want you to experience consequences. You know why? Because everything in life has consequences. I think a good job of parenting is that when we teach our kids that whenever you make a decision, expect consequences. If you make a good decision, expect good consequences. If you make a bad decision, expect bad consequences. I think one of the worst jobs of parenting is when we absorb the consequences and kids never realize there are consequences. Anyway, you all follow me? The next Sunday, Christopher proclaimed he's not going to go to church anymore. You know what? He didn't play with his friends. And you know what? He's been going to church ever since. My sister says he sings from time to time. Anger's about me changing. It's not about me blaming. Let me take the male-female thing for a minute. You all following me? The I and the we? The greatest problem, and I'm going to go back to some of the stuff I talked about on Thursday. The greatest problem for a man is he can't understand the woman's emotions. You know, that's what gets a man angry. You get so emotional. He thinks the biggest problem in his marriage is he married a woman that was too emotional. So what gets a man into a fight with his wife when she gets emotional? Well, the anger's about me changing, not about me blaming. You see, with a man, his biggest problem is there's too much I. That's the thing about the money. You know, the man is too much I. It's my money instead of our money. So he argues with his wife. He gets angry when she gets emotional. Anger's about me changing, not about me blaming. So instead of getting angry because you don't understand your wife's emotional life, and you know why you don't understand it is because you don't have one for your own. Anger's about me changing, not about me blaming. Hey, honey, I know I can't handle your emotions because I can't handle my own. And I'm going to learn. I'm going to get rid of this anger. I'm going to get in touch with my heart. I'm going to try to be a person to you. And I'm going to get to know the kids, my kids. I'm going to become their friends. And I'm going to really bond with my grandkids. I'm going to get in touch with my heart. Anger is about me changing. It's not about me blaming. A man has to become much more of a we. Now, you know the two things about emotions? Emotions are neither right nor wrong. It's a terrible statement to tell somebody they shouldn't feel that way. Because they're neither right nor wrong, but they say a lot about what's going on inside of us. And you know what? They're only temporary. See, if a man doesn't understand that about himself, he's never going to understand it in a woman. You know what's a woman's biggest problem with her man? Is the man has too much freedom. A man can come and go as he wants, while oftentimes the woman is going to feel she's a prisoner of the home or a prisoner of the relationship. She's going to wait all day for that telephone call. A woman gets angry at her husband because he wants to have too much of a personal life. The woman wants too much of a we. She needs to develop her own personal life. She needs to become more of an I. Because until she has a personal life, she's never going to understand it in a man. So when I get angry about my husband wanting all this freedom, anger's about me changing, not about me blaming. Honey, I know I've made you and the kids my personal life. I know I got to get out there and start becoming a person to myself, becoming my own best friend, building a personal spiritual life. Anger's about me changing, not about me blaming. Are you following me? So the woman has to become more of an I. Now sometimes it's reversed. Sometimes the man has more of the feminine energy and the woman more of the male energy, so it could be vice versa. Let me lastly, because Father Walsh is going to have the healing service for those that wish to stay, and I'll tell you that we're staying 2 o'clock today, that it's a wonderful gift he has, unbelievable gift he has. In fact, he's the only person I've ever met. A lot of people claim to be that really have the gift, that I know have the gift. I've seen it. Anyway, let me talk about teenagers. Do some of you have some teenagers? Let me talk about anger's about me changing, not about me blaming. You can apply this to husband and wives. It's very applicable, but let me take the teenage relationship. As I've been talking about during this mission, kids have a lot of fear today. A lot of fear. There's a lot of ways they can get into trouble. You know, I didn't know what a drug was when I was in high school, you know? We never knew anything about drugs. Sex, you know, we behaved ourselves. You know, people think we were so straight about sexuality because we were afraid of hell. I think the reason why we weren't so sexual was because there wasn't so much stress in society. It was a much simpler world. I think today there's a lot more stress. Kids have a lot of pressure. Look at, you know, I told you about this the other night. I think I did. I think we're using our children's childhood to prepare them for the economic system. We've made them so thoroughly competitive. See, I see this in California. And you know, most parents will tell me they're living in insanity. You know, both parents working all week. They come home and one parent takes one set of kids, the other parent takes another set of kids, and they go from activity to activity to activity. If someone were to watch you doing it, they'd think you were crazy. And a lot of people think it's nuts. But you know what? They're so afraid their kid is going to lose the competitive edge if they don't do everything. You know? So there's a lot of fear with kids. I look at when I taught kids, they never worried about the SAT test. Today, if you get a low grade, you're destroyed, Your life is ended. Anyway, I think kids live with a lot of fear today. And you know something, I doubt this would happen in Colorado. I can't believe this. This happens in Marin County. When the kids graduate from high school, they go down, boys and girls together, to Mexico for a week. And the hotels supply the chaperones, like they're really going to be chaperones. See, we give our kids so much freedom, but not much responsibility. What is a kid going to do down there for a week? It's going to be drugs, alcohol, and sex. Then we wonder why our kids get pregnant, I'll tell you something, my kid would never do it. I'd show you the conservative side of me. Not as long as he's in my house, anyway. But there's a lot of fear in kids. And you know how they hide that fear? With arrogance. See, I've learned in my ministry, when I counsel people, I have only about a half hour with a person, at most. And I've got to figure out what your problem is. You know what I look at? I look at the mask that you're wearing. Because if I can figure out what your mask is, I know what you're denying. Because if you want to hide something, you're going to create the opposite. That's why the most angry people in the world are people that never get angry. I gave 5 straight retreats up in Sacramento to 12-step people. My first retreat was alcoholic men. The second retreat was alcoholic women, alcoholic couples, Al-Anon, and the last one was codependency. I gave 5 straight weekends. And the retreat master put out this information or these evaluations because he wanted to find out how the retreat was doing, and he gave it to each group. When I finished the 5 retreats, the retreat master came to me and said, "Tom, I look at 4 of these evaluations and they're fantastic. I'm really proud of the work that I'm doing. But if I were to listen to this one group, I'd close the retreat house down tomorrow." He said, "What are they called?" Al-Anon. That's the spouses of alcoholics. You see, they're still so angry that they see everything through that anger. And you know what he said to me? "But they have such nice faces." In fact, if you want to know, it's a great test, my friends. If you want to know how in touch you are with your emotions, look in the mirror and see if you have natural expression on your faces. You're going to find that people that have buried their anger, they may have very pleasant faces, but they have no emotion on their faces. Are you following me? So if we want to hide something, we create the opposite. That's why the Archie Bunker, the guy that sees everything in black and white, the expert on everything, on the inside he knows nothing. Because things aren't black and white, they're gray. And how does he hide? He doesn't know anything. He pretends like he knows everything. The most insecure women act like they have it all together. There's a lot of men that thought they were marrying a very independent woman until the day they got married and they discovered they married a very dependent woman. If you want to hide your dependency, you're going to create the opposite, and you're going to act like you have it all together. Are you following me? Now, how do kids hide their fears? They create the opposite. Arrogance. Now look at the parents. When I'm telling you before, the greatest gift I have that I'm a celibate is I don't have to worry about kids. I think it'll give me about 5 or 6 extra years. I think there's a lot of fear in being a parent today. A lot of fear. But you know what it makes most parents do? Control. So you know what the ingredients of World War III with teenagers? Arrogance meeting control. That's what happens in a lot of families when you have teenagers. You all following me? Now, anger is about me changing, not about me blaming. Now, I'm going to suggest something here if you have teenagers, but I suggest it for all of you. There is a gigantic difference between listening with an agenda and listening without an agenda. Listening with an agenda means I have the answer before you start talking. And while you're talking, I'm not listening to words you're saying because I'm thinking about what I'm going to say or what I want you to do. That's not listening, that's controlling. Listening without an agenda means I don't have the answer before you start talking. And while you're talking, I'm listening not only to your words, but your feelings behind the words. And how do you know I'm listening? Because I don't know what I'm going to say until you finish talking. Because oftentimes your feelings are much different than the words. And if I really listen, I can hear the feelings behind the words. Now, if I were to pass out a piece of paper to each one of you, and I were to ask you to draw a picture of your face with your ears the size of the amount of listening that you do, and your mouth the size of the amount of controlling that you do, what would your picture look like? Let me ask you something very honestly, my friends. Do you know that there's a difference between listening and hearing? If you think they are the same things, you've never learned to listen. You see, we're born to hear, but we have to learn to listen. In fact, you know something, my friends? If somebody were to ask me, what is the greatest way that you can show unconditional love to somebody? You know what I tell you? It's by truly listening to that person. That's why you can't listen to somebody and watch television. You can't listen to somebody and read the newspaper. Listening is a sacred act. It's a spiritual act. Now I'm going to show you a couple of reasons why this is so precious, learning to listen. Now, my friends, there's a gigantic difference between listening and hearing. There's a gigantic difference between acceptance and approval. They are not the same things. There's very different whether I accept you, whether I approve you. People that love conditionally, they make them the same thing. If you don't get married the way I want you to get married, I'm not going to the wedding. We make acceptance and approval the same thing. You know how we show that we accept somebody? By truly listening to that person. That's the greatest gift that we give to anybody. We take the time to listen. We, as Don said, we pay attention. I mean, friends, look at this. How do you feel when you're around somebody that makes you feel like you're the most precious person in the world? Doesn't that make you feel special? But when I'm talking to you, you are the most precious person in the world because you're the person I'm talking to. How do you feel when you're talking to somebody whose mind is preoccupied? You feel lonely, don't you? You know. Now, let me show you how this works so I'm not giving you pie in the sky stuff. I used to be a dean of discipline. And you know, my friends, it's one of the things I'm really proud of. When I was dean of discipline, they used to, in the yearbooks, they used to dedicate the yearbooks to me as the most loved person on campus, the disciplinarian. You know why? I was their servant. I wasn't there to terrorize them, I was there to serve them. I made positive punishments, not negative punishments. I said yes unless there's a reason to say no, not no unless there's a reason to say yes. But I think where I did the most work, the good work, is I was the guy that had to punish the kids. I dealt with the angry kids. And you know, some of those kids could be pretty angry. And they come into my office, and I tried never to have a lecture or a sermon that I was going to give them. I wanted to listen to what was going on inside of them before I ever said anything. Now, sometimes those kids were so hard to get to open up. But they basically trusted me. And I'd ask good questions. And eventually those kids would open up. You know what I discovered? For so many of those kids, their parents had been through a bloody divorce, or they were going through one. Or one or other of the parents had a drinking problem. Or the kid had been verbally abused the night before. And it was my job to punish the kid. I discovered that most kids' problems were family problems. And I had to work with the family. Or they were mental disease types, people with ADD like I do, or obsessive-compulsive disorders, or bipolar. Now, sometimes I had to punish those kids. Sometimes I even had to throw them out of school. But you know what I discovered, my friends? Those kids respected what I had to say. Why? Because I had taken the time to listen. That showed that I accepted them. And in the process of listening to them, I heard things I didn't approve of. But it was in the context of acceptance. You know, I'm just going to put this little parenthesis in here. Guys, do your wives ever tell you that you're not emotionally present? That you don't give them the kind of emotional support they need in life? Do you ever hear that from your wives? You know what they're asking for? All they want you to do is listen to them without an agenda. That's all they want you to do, is accept them. But you know what the guy is usually doing? He's not listening to a word she's saying because he's thinking about how he can fix her. So then when he starts to fix her, they get in this big fight. She doesn't want to be fixed. She just wants to be listened to. Isn't that right, ladies? Now, guys and gals, you know one thing, last thing, I just got a few moments. I mentioned the difference between an argument and a discussion. You never win an argument because it's not about truth. It's about being in control. A discussion is about the truth. You know what I really recommend for those of you who are married, those of you in families, that whenever there's an argument, you use that phrase, because usually one person has to be more sane than the other. Use that phrase that I used. Did I tell you the phrase I used that my mother taught me? My dad always had to be right. So how my mom got out of an argument, she used to tell my dad, you may be right. You may be right. What she was saying, you're darn wrong, but I don't want to talk about it anymore. And he never caught on. So the best way of getting out of an argument is telling the other person they may be right. And you end the argument. Because believe me, my friends, nobody gains with an argument. See, I don't believe that the man is the head of the house. My daddy loved that from Scripture. Women, be submissive to your husbands in all things possible. He used to want to get up and applaud. Paul was a male chauvinist, but so was every other male in Paul's world. The Greek, the Roman world, the Jewish world, they all presumed that women were second class to men. I think it's shared wisdom. I think the woman listens to her husband without an agenda, and the man listens to his wife without an agenda, and together they create the common wisdom in their family. It comes from listening, not from controlling. Now, what I tell you to do, because I think listening is one of the most valuable spiritual things we can ever do, I tell you, get a big jar and put it in your family room. The youngest kids to the oldest kids. If you're single, if you're widowed, for your family. Every time somebody listens with an agenda, they have to put a quarter in the jar. See, it doesn't take a genius to know when someone is not listening. You'll be talking to your spouse, and their mind will be a million miles away. And you'll say, honey, you're not listening. And he'll go in his pocket, and he'll drop a quarter in the jar. Third time he's been to the bank this week. Or you will learn the language of listening. You'll start saying to one another, don't think a thought. Don't say a word until you've heard what I've said. Now, what I recommend that you do is do it to Christmas. It takes a long time to listen. And then, you know what? Your whole family can vacation in Hawaii. Or you can feed the hungry of Denver, whatever you prefer. You know why I know that works? I'm the only person from San Francisco that uses the word because. I don't know if you noticed. Everybody else says because. You know why I say because? When I was in the 9th grade, my English teacher had a jar in the classroom. Every time we used the word because in class, we had to put a dime in the jar. I learned how to say because, whatever value that is. So I know it works. I know it works. And you know what happens, my friends? When you do that with your teenagers and your parents, you know what's going to happen? The parents are going to hear the fear behind the arrogance. And instead of reacting to the arrogance, they're going to react to the fear. And the kids will hear the love that's behind the control. They won't react to the control, they'll react to the love. And that's how you communicate. Do you follow me? So finally, my 4-step process of how I make anger positive. First of all, you got to know the issue. You got to spend some time. Too much I, too much we. You got to tell the person how you're going to change. I had to tell Don that I wasn't going to keep controlling. I was going to become more of a we. My sister had to tell her son, honey, there's a new sheriff in town. From now on, son, I'm going to let you live your own life, but from now on there are consequences. She had to tell him. The husband has to tell the wife, honey, I know that I don't know how to share my heart. I don't know how to tell people I love them. I don't know how to get close to people. But I want you to know, and I'll tell you something, my friends, I'm Irish. And it's almost impossible to get an Irishman to talk about his feelings. Because there's so much anger in the culture. And the same thing with Germans. A lot of German men. You know, they pass it on from generation to generation. They got so much anger in them, they never can tell anybody they love them. Or they only give silent praise like I talked about last night. You know what I mean? Anger's about me changing, not about me blaming. I'm going to get in touch with my heart. I'm going to get rid of the anger. I'm going to love my family more. I'm going to get to know the kids. The wife has to tell her husband, I know I've made the children, I've made you my personal life. I'm going to go out to a bigger world out there. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to get involved. I'm going to become a parish minister. I'm going to be a Eucharistic minister to shut-ins. I'm going to go take a course in music. I've always wanted to paint. I'm going to build a personal life. That's the second step. You've got to inform the person. The third step, always beware of the negative forms of being angry. What I talked about Monday night. I have a friend of mine, he's a rager. And whenever he rages, I know he's a rager, he knows he's a rager. I don't say a word, I don't fight, he's much bigger and stronger than I am. I don't take it personally. He's not doing it to me. It's genetically conditioned to be a rager. And then when he finishes raging, we talk about it, because he knows he is one, I know he is one. See, if he wasn't honest about it, we can never do anything positive. Now, it's gotten much better for him. The more he does his daily maintenance, the more he writes his anger letters. The more he does that kind of stuff, the more he does these things I've been telling you. The explosions are not so violent because he does his daily maintenance work. So any of you that are ragers, you've got to really work on a daily maintenance. So when the explosion happens, it's only a little puff. It's not a violent eruption. I'm just the opposite. Don can tell you this. I'll make the jokes about how money's going down the drain. Isn't it so funny how we're throwing money in the toilet? Ha, 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 ha. And you know what he'll say to me? He'll say, "You're angry, Tom." And I say, "No, I'm not." I've never admitted I was angry the first time. But I'm honest enough with myself to know that when I'm passive-aggressive, I'm angry. When I'm making those zingers, I'm angry. So I come back and I say, "Don, there's some things we have to talk about." So you always got to know your negative forms, like I talked about Monday, because if you don't know them, you don't own them, you're not emotionally honest, they will take over and make a bad situation worse. And finally, the last step, always beware of the other person's counter moves. So much of relationships is who's in control. A husband will tell his wife, "Honey, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to work on getting rid of the anger. I'm going to develop an emotional life." And the wife's going to say, "I've been praying for this for years. Let me help you. Let me mother you. Let me be in control." Or the wife is going to say, "Honey, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to become part of a bigger world. I'm going to get involved in the parish. I'm going to learn some music, do some painting." And the husband's going to say, "Honey, I'm 100% behind you. Go out and be whatever you want to be, but make sure dinner's on the table every night at 5:30. You can become whatever you want to be as long as you keep taking care of me." See, you make the right decision not because you want to change the other person. That's manipulation. You make the right decision because it's best for you. You follow me? That's the 4 steps, my friends. That's the positive way that I grow from anger. I bring it to prayer. God bless you. I promise you the best talk of the 2 weeks tomorrow night. I encourage you to stay, but we have a few minutes of just, for those that wish to leave, those that wish to stay, I encourage you to come down in front more. Father will have his healing service. But God bless you, and thank you all for coming. Tonight, I want to let Don say a few words, and here, say a few words, and let me tell you where you're going to stand.
I just wanted to thank you. You know, from the bottom of my heart, it makes it all worthwhile, and you know, you give us energy and motivate us to continue to try, you know, to share the sunlight of the Spirit that's worked in our lives. And without you all showing up, we would have been done a long time ago. So thank you. You know, pretty much, I think for me, the key to having a spirituality is when things don't work the way I want. That's usually when I get angry. And for a long time, I wondered why Jesus said, "Don't judge." And I think I came upon at least the answer that works for me, and that is that, you know, when I judge something to be good or right, turns out that's just something that I want to happen. If it's something that I want, I consider it good. Now, something that's bad, that's something that I don't want. And I think, you know, I don't always know what's good or bad. I used to think I did. And today I realize that a lot of times that's jaded by my desire. And my desire sometimes isn't always what's best for me. And you know, sometimes I hate to say I practice what I preach, but Father always tells me about that. And you know, it's been an emotional roller coaster this week because I thought I was moving to Tucson. And my wife, she's been in Phoenix, going down to Tucson, making offers on this house I really wanted. Had a lot of desire because it's going to be close to my kids, and everything looked like it was going through, and I was kind of pushing it a little too hard. Well, it turns out it didn't go through, and I found that out today. And I'm like, oh, that's terrible, that's bad. And I wanted to get in there and manipulate because I know I could fix it. I know I could manipulate my wife into doing what I want. But I have to realize God's will is not something I always can see. And if I didn't do this, if I didn't look at things, if I didn't turn the other cheek and try to look at it from somebody else's perspective, in this case my wife's, and Father Allender's, because they both said, Don, you got to do the responsible thing. It's not about what you want. And so I was able, and I didn't like it, but I was able to do that and say, okay, honey, we'll start all over. And you know, when you get that close to something you desire, you know, sometimes my agenda, my will be done, has really blocked me from the sunlight of the Spirit. And today, you know, my spirituality helps me deal with ambiguity, the outcome, how things are going to turn out. Because, you know, I'm not in the result business anymore. I can do the footwork. But if I'm in the result-built business, what happens is I have a lot of expectations, and today, expectations, when they're not met, they lead to resentments and anger. So if I do the footwork, and I have a little bit of faith, if it doesn't come out the way I want, I'm okay with it some of the time. And as I grow spiritually, I'm okay. Acceptance is the answer to all my problems. And today, you know, what I really, you know, I used to think, what's bliss? You know, when you hear about the mystics, when they get bliss and the ecstasy, I don't want that. What I want is an occasional glimpse at serenity, some peace in my life. And today I know if I have a lot of expectations, as soon as they're not met, I start manipulating and controlling, and I ruin the gap that God needs to turn out. Because you know what? There's a story that someone told me once about this, that a guy had gotten a new horse, and he was so excited about the horse. And the next day he was out riding the horse, and he fell off and broke his leg. And all of a sudden, that's a bad thing that happened. And everybody's, oh my God, you're going to be laid up forever. Well, the next day, something terrible happened. There was a world war, and he didn't have to go. So what one day looked like a really bad thing, the next day turned out to be a really good thing. And if we have faith, that happens. And so today I don't have to be in the result business. I don't have to have a lot. I still have some expectations, but I don't have to have them all. And today I can let people help me turn the other cheek and look at things differently. And that's a miracle, because, you know, I'm one of those guys that when I wanted something, if I did A and B, C was going to happen. And when it didn't, there went my serenity. Spirituality gives me a glimpse of that from time to time if I can let it go. And that's a miracle in this person's life, and that's what I wish for you. I just want to end on one thing. You know what happened? I went back to ground zero. My I'm a third-generation fireman, and I just wanted to say, you know, the fire that's burning out of control here, people are risking their lives, and there's a lot at stake. So I just wanted to say a prayer for all the firemen, firemen, and that's old school, firefighters, because there's fire women as well. And just a moment of silence for the people who lost public safety employees in 9/11, because to me, you know, that's what, you know, what greater thing is to lay down your life for your brother, and that's what they did. And I'm just going to end on that, because it was pretty touching going back to ground zero. And someday, you know, today I have opportunities to be of service to people, and if I don't get too selfish, I don't miss them. And they weren't selfish at all, and I'm grateful for that. And I pray to God for them and their families. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, God gives us everything we need. All the love, all the forgiveness we could ever desire. But God doesn't give us everything we want. You know, thank God we don't get everything we want, you know. And I'd love to have a beautiful big house, servants, a great car. I'd probably get myself in trouble. Anyway, let me begin tonight. You know, when I was younger, a young priest, I was really into being successful and being popular. And I was a good preacher, I was a good teacher. And people used to ask me, did I have a good childhood? And since I had loving parents, I always said, oh yeah, I had a loving childhood, I had a wonderful childhood. And in many ways I did. But you know, when they asked me the question when I was young, it really didn't matter. It wasn't my question. I was interested in being successful. You know, they say the old thing, a man spends the first half of his life building up his ego, and life spends the second half taking it down. Well, I was building up my ego. Well, I started to get into my late 30s, and while I was successful and I was popular, I was also very lonely. I used to get 200 Christmas cards, but I didn't have 4 good friends. I didn't know how to invite people to enter into my life, and I didn't know how to enter into other people's lives. So I had no real intimacy in my life. And so while I was successful and I was popular, I discovered I was very lonely. So I started looking at my life, asking some pretty serious questions. And one day, it came out to me so clearly that even though I had a beautiful childhood in so many ways, I had a very painful childhood. My dad, as I said, was a practicing alcoholic. He was a bar drinker. He had a program his last 34 years of his life, and it became a gift in our family. But not when I was a child. So whenever I went to bed at night, I could never go to sleep unless I heard that garage door open. I listened to every sound out in the street, hoping it was my dad's car driving up the driveway. And there was many a night when my dad never came home. And I didn't sleep at all that night. And I went up the next morning, I went to school without having ever slept that night. Little 4th, 5th grader. Then when my dad didn't come home, my next fear was when he was going to come home. Because then I knew there was going to be a violent struggle. My mom and dad used to have terrible arguments, and they were followed by the silent treatment. I lived in a home in which my parents didn't speak to each other for weeks, where you could cut the tension with the knife. I can't tell you how lonely I felt to be a little boy living in a home in which my parents didn't speak to each other. In fact, my whole childhood was preoccupied with my dad's drinking and its effect on my mom. In those days, we used to have a lot of picnics. You'd have parish picnics, neighborhood picnics, and even the bars had picnics. So we'd go to these picnics, and everybody seemed to have a wonderful time. They'd play volleyball, they'd swim, play softball. I didn't have a good time. You know why? I always kept one eye on how much my dad was drinking, because he had to drive us home. My mom didn't know how to drive. I could tell you some horror stories. I'll never forget one time my dad had a shortcut. We'd visit one of his friends. He'd been drinking heavy. And he thought he found a shortcut. You know what it was? It was a fire road that was straight up with a cliff straight down. And he couldn't turn around when he got to the end of it. So he had to back down that steep hill with a sheer cliff, absolutely drunk. God, I get goosebumps when I still think of those things. My childhood was so painful that I joined the Jesuits. I became a priest after the 8th grade. Only lasted a year. Then I went to a Jesuit high school, and I joined the Jesuits when I was 17, when I graduated from high school. You know why I became a priest? To get out of the house. That's how painful my childhood was. But here's the astonishing thing. I never talked to anybody about that pain of growing up in an alcoholic home until I was well in my 40s. I buried all that feeling inside of me. And I took on my parents' feelings, my dad and its effect on my mom. So since I didn't have any feelings because I buried them all, I could never communicate. Anybody ever asked me how I was doing? I was always doing fine. I could be in a hospital bed with 6 hours to live. And the nurse could come in and say, "How you doing, Father?" "Oh, I'm doing just fine." In fact, the amazing thing about our family, my dad had a cardiac arrest. He was on driving, and it was in Novato, California. Well, the Jesuits had a recreation center there. A villa is what they call it. And they let us use that villa while we're waiting to see if my dad was going to survive, hour by hour. For 4 days, we didn't know whether he was going to make it or not. And you know the amazing thing? My two sisters, my brother and I, my mom, we'd be walking around and we'd be asking each other how we're doing. And everybody was saying, "We're doing just fine." Because we all had buried our feelings. Here's the amazing thing. You know, I had my best friend in high school and grade school. We were together from the 2nd through the 12th grade, except the year I was in high school. We played sports together. We double dated together. Both his parents died from alcoholism. It didn't say that in the death certificate, but that's what killed him. Do you know in those 12 years of being best friends, we never once shared with each other the pain of growing up in an alcoholic home? We buried all those feelings. And you know what else happened to me? Since my parents weren't there for me as I was growing up because they had so many of their own problems, I learned as a child that you can never really trust anybody. Nobody's ever there to really help you. So what did I learn as a child? Don't feel, don't communicate, don't trust. Suppose we would have met and married when we were 25. You would have met and married a man who didn't feel, who couldn't communicate, and didn't trust. Wouldn't we have had a marvelous marriage? You see, there is a value to celibacy. Just think of the pain I saved one lady by becoming a priest. I mean that. In fact, you know what? I think I'm finally ready to get married. That's not an advertisement, it's just a fact. Now here's the amazing things, my friends. I want you to see this because all families have family systems. I became the responsible one. I was the older one. I was going to fix everything. My sister, the next youngest, she was the family people pleaser. She was a peacemaker. She'd go to my father and she said, "Dad, if you quit drinking, Mom's going to forgive you." Then she'd go to Mom and said, "Dad's promised he's forgiven, that he's going to quit drinking, so can you forgive him?" So always trying to bring peace. You know what happened? She married an alcoholic. She had 6 kids, and 5 of them are definitely alcoholics. It's getting harder and harder to say everything's going to get fine. My brother, he was a family adjuster. He learned to adjust to everything. He never let anything bother him. My youngest, my sister, she acted out the family turmoil. She became the family problem. She'd get caught drinking at a dance. And my dad would go down and talk to the principal. And then he'd come home and say, "Anybody with a daughter like that needs a drink." She became the family problem. So we all developed these roles in our family. Now, I want to tell you an amazing story, my friends. My dad had been sober 34 years before he died. When he was sober 24 years, he had back surgery. And during back surgery, they gave him Percodan and Valium. If any of you know anything about alcoholism, a drug is a drug is a drug. It was like giving him a drink. Now my dad, whenever he drank too much, we could always tell, he'd look at you with these glassy eyes and he'd ask you, "Who did you ever beat?" That was his favorite phrase. "Who did you ever beat?" Well, here he was, 24 years sober, visiting him in the hospital, and he asking us with those glassy eyes, who did we ever beat? And you know what happened? We all acted like we did 24 years before. I became responsible. I went to the doctor and the nurses. I was going to straighten it out. My sister, she went around to everybody and told us it's going to get better tomorrow. My brother just sat there and read the newspaper and watched the television. And my sister threw a tantrum, and she became the family problem, and we were all concerned about her. The astonishing thing was, and my mom, of course, denied there was a problem. We all acted like we had done 30 years before. That's how strong family systems are. Do you follow me? Now, so what do we mean when we hear that word, a dysfunctional family? A dysfunctional family is a family that can't share their feelings, they can't communicate, and they don't trust one another. That's a dysfunctional family. So what's a spiritual family? A family that can share their feelings with each other, a family that can communicate, and a family that can trust each other. That's a spiritual family. So I'm going to take each one of them tonight. Now, some of you want to know that series I have, Family Spirituality, when I talk about the marriage. I talk about these three things: feelings, communication, and trust in marriage. I'm going to talk about the family tonight, but that series applies it to the marriage. Now, let's talk about feelings. You know, one of our big problems, for all of us, is when we were kids, we were taught how to feel. We were punished when we had the right feelings, wrong feelings, and we were rewarded when we had the right feelings. We were told you shouldn't feel that way, or you should feel that way, or it's wrong to feel that way, or it's a sin to feel that way. So we learned to have the appropriate feelings. Now, there's two things about feelings. Feelings are neither right nor wrong. It's a very bad statement to tell somebody you shouldn't have these feelings because you're giving them a moral value to them. Feelings are neither right nor wrong, but they say a lot about what's going on inside of me. And feelings are only temporary. Now, I find in my life that the only people that I can feel real comfortable with are people that I can share my feelings with. If I have to tell you the feelings you want me to have, that's conditional love. Now, I think Donna's talked about this. I've talked about this all week, the importance of our feelings, finding God in our feelings. Now, what I recommend, I'm not going to talk about this first section much because I spent so much time last night on listening without an agenda. I really believe that, my friends. I think it's the greatest way you can institute in a family system where we appreciate each other's feelings. Because when you start listening without an agenda, you're going to hear the feelings behind the words. And believe me, for most of us, our feelings are much different than our words. And we're going to be able to hear those feelings and respond to those feelings because they're where we are most real. And that's what makes it so difficult, my friends, because we grow up in these family systems where our feelings are so much controlled. And we develop all these appropriate feelings, but you know what? We're not real. It's wonderful, and it's a great marriage when couples grow together, when they can trust their feelings to each other, when they can talk about their fears, when they can talk about their angers or their guilts or their grieving. They can talk to each other about it. So I've talked a lot about that, so I'm not going to go into it any more than that tonight. I want to talk about communication, though. You know how I learned to preach? By teaching high school kids. I found that when I talked to the kids' hearts, they listened. When I talked to their heads, they were in another planet. Now, be honest with me now. When a priest preaches a sermon and he talks to your heart, don't you listen? But when he talks to your head, don't you daydream? I sure do. Some guy's giving me this big sermon on scripture studies and all that kind of stuff. My mind's in a different planet. I found out that when I talked to the kids' hearts, they listened. Now, I found when I was a teacher, I found that if the kids liked you, they'd work much harder for you. And I remember, you know what my secret with the kids was? I did not forget I was a teenager once when I taught teenagers. I used to tell them my story. I tell them my own experiences of growing up. As I said the other night, it's amazing how many parents forget their own teenage years and their own struggles when they start having teenagers. I tell them stories. I'll never forget. Sometimes it can backfire. I taught American literature. Now, the first piece of American literature we taught was Jonathan Edwards. He was a Puritan preacher. And they used to have his sermon in the anthology book. Well, I'd come in with a collar like I was a Puritan preacher, and I'd use my booming voice, and I'd give them the sermon. They'd act like they were Puritans. And you know what it said in this sermon? That you human beings, you're 365 million times more ugly than the most venomous evil serpent that walks this earth. Isn't that a wonderful thought? That we're 365 million times more ugly than the worst serpent? Don't you think we got away from the gospel a little bit? Don't you think they kind of missed the point? They sure lost Jesus in the process, you know. But I used to tell the kids, I used to describe to them how ugly the snakes were, because I was with my mom and my sister. I was probably 4th grade, my sister was 3rd grade. We're walking up the Russian River in Northern California, and suddenly my mom starts screaming, and there's a rattlesnake in the middle of the road. And I told the kids, ever since I saw that rattlesnake, I've been deathly afraid of snakes. Well, you know, I took about 40 kids camping down the Havasupai Falls in the Grand Canyon. And while they were hiking in the canyon, you know what they found? They found a snake. You know what they did with the snake? They put it in my sleeping bag. You should have heard my scream when that slimy little creature touched that gentle little foot. You could hear me in the next planet. So sometimes it could backfire. But you know, I found, and the kids do, they work for you a lot more if they like you. You know what my secret was the kids was? If the kids can know me, they can love me. See, you have to know somebody before you can love them. Have you ever experienced maybe in the neighborhood or where you work or here in the parish that you don't like somebody? And then someday that person starts sharing something personal about themselves with you, and you start to like them because you're starting to know them. Haven't you all experienced that? See, this is the problem, and I know it's true for both the German culture and the Irish culture. But it's so hard. I know as an Irishman, my dad comes from Scanlon and Letty. We're about 95% Irish. And it's almost impossible to get an Irishman to talk about his feelings. Whenever anything gets on a personal level, they shut down. I think the same is true for a lot of Germans. Well, see, here's the problem. See, if a man never shares his fears, his anxieties, his loneliness with his wife because he's so afraid she's going to fall apart, His wife will never be able to love him the way he needs to be loved because she doesn't know him. We can only love somebody to the degree that they're willing to let us know them. Are you following me in that? That's a very important spiritual principle. If somebody won't let us know them, we can never get to love them. Well, I learned this about the kids a long time ago. I found out if I, just like my friends, I'm sure it's one of my benefits in preaching. And I've heard from a lot of you that you love me. You know why? Because these 2 weeks you've gotten to know me. You know? That's my secret. And that's true for anybody. You get to know anybody, you can love them. Now, what I didn't understand, though, was this is how I got to know my father. See, I told you Sunday, I think it was, my dad was dad and I was son. I couldn't break through it. We couldn't start becoming friends. Every time I tried to become his friend, he'd get me angry. Well, I did this anger work I talked about on Tuesday, but let me tell you what happened. I was given a retreat to 80 couples in Santa Cruz, California. And during one of my conferences, I said to the whole group, with my mom and dad sitting right in front of me, that I wanted to become friends with my dad. That I didn't know my father. That all he was dad. He wasn't a person to me. You know why I did it in front of everybody? Because they'd protect me. They would tell my father that I was right. So I was so afraid. How was I? See, my dad was a strong personality, and how was I going to tell my dad, hey, Dad, let's stop being father, son, let's start being friends. I realized if I did it in the group, they'd protect me. Well, you know what happened after that talk? My dad took a real risk. We took a walk for 3 hours along the Santa Cruz beaches. And that day, my dad started to tell me his story. See, I knew there were problems in his life, but he never talked about his childhood. For the first time in his life, he told me how his dad had abandoned him and his mom. He was an only child when he was 6 months old during the Depression. He talked about how hard it was to grow up during the Depression. How he worked 2 jobs while he was in grade school to put food on the table, to feed his mom and his grandma. I never knew any of this. You know, and do you know the amazing thing? My dad and I used to fight about everything. We couldn't agree what day of the week it was. You know why? Because we were just alike. It's awful hard for 2 people who both always have to be right to agree with each other. When my dad started to tell me his story, so much of his story was my story. So many of his struggles were my struggles. So much of his wisdom was wisdom I needed to hear. There was never anybody in my dad's life who was more like him than me. And there's never been anybody in my life who's been more like me than my father. As I told you the other night, it's really scary as I'm watching myself become my father. You know, and you know the amazing thing? It took, I'd say, about 5 years for my dad to tell his story. But we used to start taking trips together. Wednesday was always our day. I took my dad down to Watsonville, where he was born. It's about 2 hours south of San Francisco, so we could see his birthplace for the last time. And we drive down and we came back together, and my dad told me these marvelous stories about his growing up. I took my dad over to the Delta, where he had his fishing boat, so he could say goodbye to his fishing buddies for the last time. And we sat around that table in a big restaurant, and they shared these marvelous stories about my dad's fishing. They were some of the most sacred moments of my life. One of the greatest gifts God has given me has been a friendship with my dad. I'm not saying this to you, my friends, if you lost a parent and were never able to become friends. But learn from it, grow from it. Don't let it happen to any of your kids. Now, this is what I tell you, my friends. As your kids go through their different stages of life, share with them what happened to you during those stages. The mistakes you made, the things you learned. You've got to always remember that your kids will never know anybody more like them than you. I remember when I used to teach high school, and a kid would graduate from high school and get married, and I perform his wedding. I baptize his kids. And then the kid would come to high school, and you know, lo and behold, he'd make the same mistakes his father did. And he'd come to me and say, Tom, what can I do with my son? And I tell him, share with him your story. Tell him the mistakes you learned. Tell him how you learned from it and what you learned. You know what most fathers would tell me? I could never tell that to my sons. They're not going to listen to your sermons anyway. It's much better to tell them your story. And then when your kids get in their late 30s, early 40s, when they start getting serious about who they are and getting to know their story, then that's the time when you really need to tell them your story, because that will help them put their life together, and it will help them get to know you so they can love you as a person. See, when I let my dad tell me his story, not only did I get to know and love him as a person, but it really helped me put my story together. I live with my mom now. You know, let me just say this point. I did a lot of work with the Native Americans. I taught on the reservation. And I studied the Native American culture. And you know, they were a lot more spiritual than a lot of the white men that came to convert them. But in the Indian culture, it was a priority to pass on the story. The story was the greatest gift that the parents gave their kids. And it was passed on from generation to generation. You know, I live with my mom now, and you know, we go out to dinner a lot. My mom loves to go out to dinner. She used to say to my dad, honey, let's go out to dinner tonight. And he always, oh, honey, it's so much easier to stay home. But he was saying it's so much cheaper to stay home. It doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be fancy. My mom just loves to eat somebody else's food. She's been cooking for over 60 years. She's tired of the kitchen. But you know, as we go out to the restaurants, you know what my mom does a lot? She tells me her story. She's 86 years old. And she's going back into her childhood and her growing up, the relatives. She loves to tell her story. It's the greatest gift that she can give me. Our stories are so precious. And so what I'm telling you in your family, the way it should be in your family, when your children are young, you are the parents. You're in charge. The kids don't run the house. But now as time goes on, and the kids are getting older, there's a process that's going on in your relationship that you're becoming less of a parent and more of a friend. And it's a process. It doesn't happen all at once. But it's a process that's happening in the relationship. And the real key to breaking through the role of being parent to friend is when you really let them know you so they can love you. Do you follow me? That's how we break through the wall. Let me take the last one now, trust. What I'm going to say about trust is built on two principles. A friend is somebody I can trust with my weaknesses. See, many of you are married. I ask you, are you friends? Can you trust each other with your weaknesses, or do you end up walking around each other on eggshells? See, I've learned more about God from my friends than from anything else in the world. Can you trust your weaknesses to your spouse? That's the first question. Here's the second. The worst thing anybody could do to me that loves me is that when I've injured somebody I love, and I injure all the people I love regularly, I have my bad days, I have my times when I'm selfish, I hurt all the people I love regularly. I'm not perfect. And when I hurt the people I love, I feel terrible. I do not enjoy hurting the people I love. But when those people that I've hurt, when they come along and make me feel more guilty than the guilt I already feel, I let out on them all the angers I feel towards myself. The worst thing anybody can do to me is punish me because I'm not perfect. To take it personally. Now, I need you to be honest now. I'm going to play psychiatrist. Make believe I'm a psychiatrist. And we're doing association. Now, when I mention your family, what's the first thing you think of? Friendship or eggshells? When weakness comes into your families, can you trust each other with your weaknesses, or do you end up walking around each other on eggshells? That's how much trust you have. Now here's the key, my friends. Do you know when parents develop that trust for each other? Is when they've let their spouse down. Is their spouse there to lift them up, or are they there to make them feel more guilty? These are the most important moments in a marriage. They're when people either build bridges of friendship or walls of separation. The most important moments in your marriage is when you let each other down. You know why, my friends? I never perform a wedding until the couple had a big fight. I tell them, don't even come and talk to me till you've had a big fight. Because I wanted to see how they handled the fight. Because I was very predictive about what was going to happen after they get married. This is when little children decide whether they can ever trust their parents or not. This is when your kids decide whether they can trust you or not. Is when they've messed up, can they trust your weaknesses to you? Do you love them the most when they deserve it the least? And that's why it's so hard to trust our parents when we're 40, even when we're 50. We're still trying to be the person they want us to be. Because we've never learned to trust our parents. Now here, my friends, is the key to trust. I cannot overstate to you how important the gospel is. The most important reality in our lives is the good news of Jesus Christ. It's worth the life and the death of Jesus Christ. And you know how sure I am of this? You could go to Mass every day of your life, and if you don't believe the gospel, it's all wasted. You could say 1,000,000 decades of the Rosary, but if you don't believe the gospel, it doesn't mean anything. See, when you really believe that God loves you without any conditions, and you live it in your heart, God loves you the most when you deserve it the least. Oh, not perfectly, but that's the direction you're going in. When you can trust your weaknesses to God, God will transform your lives, and your family will be able to trust their weaknesses to you, and they'll really be able to trust you with their weaknesses. And my friends, that's what creates intimacy. It creates intimacy in a marriage. It creates intimacy in a family. But what gives us the freedom to accept other people's weaknesses when we know God loves our weaknesses and forgives us? That's why the gospel, my friends, is the most important reality in our lives. And make no mistake about this, my friends, we in the Catholic Church, we really need a conversion to the gospel. You know, I didn't get any gospel when I was growing up. I got Bible history. That was something the Protestants believed in. And you know, I'll tell you how I really see. I think our whole institution needs a conversion. You know, that's why, my friends, I got to say the Mass on Saturday, you know, for the abused and for the reconciliation. I don't know what I'm going to say. But here's the danger for people that make the church God. Because the Catholic Church is not God. And if you make it God, you're going to be terribly disappointed. What is the institution going to do to the men that mess up? They're going to kick them out. That's not the good news of Jesus Christ. You know why? Because for some of these men, they're going to have no friends, no job. They're going to be really isolated. They're going to feel all alone. They're going to feel like spiritual lepers. And you know their only friend going to be for many of them? God's love and God's forgiveness. And maybe that experience will bring them to conversion, and maybe it's going to take that for them to surrender to God's love and God's forgiveness. Because that's the good news of Jesus Christ. Now, the institution doesn't handle it that way, but God handles it that way. Remember when the adulteress, they asked Jesus, they wanted to stone this adulteress to death, because that was the rule of Moses. And Jesus said to them, let the person that without sin cast the first stone. And in tradition, Jesus got down on the ground. He was writing on the ground. The tradition tells us he was writing out their personal sins. And they went away one by one by one, and there was nobody left. And Jesus said to the adulteress, neither will I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Don't ever doubt God's love and forgiveness. I remember, you know, I was down in Apple Valley. I just arrived at a beautiful little community in Southern California. And the newspaper came out. It was a front page story about Archbishop Sanchez. Remember? He was the archbishop that got in trouble, maybe 10 years ago. It even made 60 Minutes. And when I was reading the article, I got a sickening feeling inside of me that the KGB was going to come and take this archbishop to some monastery in the middle of Africa, where he would spend the rest of his life isolated because he embarrassed the institution. I thought to myself, there was never a time in this man's life when he needed the love of the community, when he needed the forgiveness of the community, the compassion of the community. He never needed it more in his life. So what were we going to do? We're going to isolate him in some monastery so he can feel shame the rest of his life. You know what really made this so apropos for me? I had just been to Spring, Texas. In fact, I'm going back there next year. It's a great parish. And just before I got there, the young associate had died of AIDS. They didn't send him away. They didn't make some phony excuse. The parishioners loved him all the way into eternity. And his death brought all kinds of new love to that parish. You know, my friends, that is the good news of Jesus Christ. In fact, if you want to know what Jesus Christ is really like, look at his relationship with Peter. Peter did something worse than any of us could ever do. Peter was disloyal. When Jesus needed a friend, when Jesus was in his deep agony, and he just wanted to know that his words got through, that somebody believed what he had to say, somebody was going to support him, he turned to one of his best friends. Can you be with me? Can you support me? I've never known the guy, never been with the guy. Not once, but 3 times. Peter did something worse than any of us could do. He was disloyal to Jesus. What was Jesus' reaction? He didn't give him the silent treatment. He didn't send him away. He asked him, he said, do you love me 3 times? He gave him the chance to make amends, and then he made him the pillar of the church. God chooses the weak, and he makes them strong in his love. That's the gospel. Now, I just ask you, my friends, do you have that kind of relationship with God? Do you have that kind of a God in your life that loves you the most when you deserve it the least? Because that's the good news of Jesus Christ. And you know, my friends, when you believe the gospel and you live the gospel, God's love will transform your lives, and you will give that gift away to the people that God sends into your life. And that's when trust builds in the family, when we are a Christian family. So you may be a Catholic family, but if you don't believe the gospel, and the gospel isn't the centerpiece how you live your life, you're not a Christian family. See, our families, our marriages have to be based on the good news of Jesus Christ. Then we give that kind of love to one another. And that's what it means to have a Christian family, a family that's based on God's love. Anyway, my friends, I would like to end on this because this is where I started. And I think this is what brings everything together. God bless you all. You've been wonderful people. Thank you very much.